In this journey you will hear the Queen who changed England and paid with her life. On a cold morning in May 1536, a woman walked calmly to her death inside the walls of the Tower of London. She had once been England's most powerful woman, adored, feared, and envied in equal measure. She was Anne Boleyn. But who was the woman behind the crown? Was she a schemer, a victim, or something far more extraordinary? Her story is one of ambition, betrayal, and a love so fierce it shook a kingdom. A story that changed the course of English history forever. In the next hour, we'll uncover the rise of a girl who defied convention, captivated a king, and ultimately became the most infamous queen in history. This is the untold story of Anne Boleyn, and it begins now. In the early hours of May 19, 1536, a woman walked steadily toward a scaffold inside the walls of the Tower of London. She had once been the most powerful woman in England, envied, hated, adored, feared. On this morning, she moved with a grace astonishing for someone condemned to die. She was Anne Boleyn, a queen whose life burned like a star, brilliant, disruptive, and brief. A woman whose rise rewrote the laws of a kingdom and whose fall shook a continent. Today, her name echoes across centuries, not only as one of Henry VIII's doomed wives, but as the catalyst for a religious and political revolution that altered the very soul of England. This is her story. Episode 2, Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed England forever. This is Shadows of History series, and I am your history guide. Anne Boleyn captivated Henry VIII utterly. Anne Boleyn's exact birth year remains the first mystery of her life. Most historians place it between 1500 and 1507. The strongest consensus points to 1501. Her birthplace was likely Blickling Hall in Norfolk, a grand manor associated with the rising Boleyn family. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was not born a nobleman, but he possessed something even more valuable in Tudor England: ambition, sharpened by intelligence, charm, and the ability to navigate Europe's most dangerous courts. He spoke multiple languages and served as a diplomat under both Henry VII and Henry VIII. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from the prestigious Howard family, one of England's oldest noble houses. Their marriage brought the Boleyns wealth, access, and increasing influence. Anne was the second daughter, with an older sister, Mary, and a brother, George. The Boleyn children were raised in a household steeped in expectation. Thomas Boleyn envisioned greatness: diplomatic appointments, noble marriages, proximity to the throne. He could never have imagined one of his daughters would become queen, and another would lose her life for it. But in Tudor England, fortunes turned quickly, and the Boleyns knew how to seize opportunity. Anne's education would set her apart from nearly every English woman of her generation. Around the age of 12 or 13, she was sent to continental Europe. Her first stop, the court of Archduchess Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands. Margaret's court was renowned as a centre of Renaissance humanism, an environment rich with scholars, translations of classical texts, and political debate. Anne stood out almost immediately. Margaret referred to her affectionately as La Petite Boleyn, the little Boleyn girl, and praised her quick wit. But Anne's true transformation unfolded in France. In 1515, Anne joined the household of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, during her brief marriage to King Louis XIV of France. When Louis died months later, Anne remained in France and entered the service of Queen Claude, wife of Francis I. For 7 formative years, Anne absorbed the sophistication of the French court, its fashion, its poetry, its artistic innovation, its emphasis on elegance. She studied French language and literature, courtly etiquette, dance, and music, diplomatic behavior. the emerging theological debates that questioned Rome's authority. She read reformist writers like Jacques Lefebvre and learned to navigate conversations about scripture, conscience, and church corruption. Anne returned to England around 1522 as a woman polished intellectually, culturally, and socially beyond most of her peers. She carried herself differently, confidently, almost fearlessly. And in a court where women were expected to be silent ornaments, Anne was an anomaly. She would soon become irresistible to a king and dangerous to everyone. Back in England, Anne became a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. At court she dazzled. Her French manners, her intelligence, her distinctive fashion, dark fabrics, French hoods, modest but alluring necklines, made her stand out instantly. Anne was not described as classically beautiful, yet people were captivated by her. Her expressive dark eyes, her charm, her musical talent, her ability to debate politics and religion, her refusal to be intimidated by rank men fell in love with her. Women envied or resented her. Henry VIII became obsessed. But before Anne, the king had pursued her sister Mary Boleyn, who, some allege, became his mistress. When Henry's attention shifted to Anne, many expected her to simply follow the path of countless mistresses before her. But Anne refused. Henry VIII began sending Anne letters, intimate, emotional, almost desperate. 21 survive. In these letters, Henry confesses his longing. "I have been for more than a year struck by the dart of love." He offered gifts, jewels, promises. But Anne was unmoved. She told him she would not become his mistress. If he wanted her, he would have to make her queen. It was a terrifying gamble. Queens were not replaced. Royal marriages were sacred. But Anne understood Henry. He loved a challenge. He wanted what he was denied. Anne's refusal didn't push him away. It consumed him. Soon Henry's desire for Anne collided with his deepest insecurity. He had no male heir. For Henry VIII, this wasn't personal vanity, it was political survival. Without a son, England risked civil war, and so the king concluded that God was punishing him for marrying Catherine, his brother's widow. His solution became the most infamous political crisis of the Tudor age, the King's Great Matter, his attempt to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. For 7 agonizing years, 1526-1533, Henry sought permission from Pope Clement VII to annul his marriage to Catherine, but the Pope's hands were tied. Catherine's nephew was none other than Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. Granting Henry's request would offend Charles, destabilize politics, and damage Rome's authority. Anne became the lightning rod for public anger. She was labeled homewrecker, witch, heretic, usurper of Catherine's place. But behind court walls, Anne played a sophisticated political role. She introduced Henry to reformist texts, particularly William Tyndale's writings, arguing that kings had the authority to rule their own church. She urged him to act on his conscience, not the Pope's decree. Henry's desire to marry Anne evolved into something larger, a challenge to the entire Catholic establishment. By 1532, Henry had begun to separate England from papal authority. In 1533, he appointed Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury, who declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. The path was now open. Henry and Anne married in secret, then publicly in April 1533. Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in June, pregnant, triumphant, and surrounded by both glory and hatred. Anne's coronation was extraordinary. Henry spared no expense. The city was decorated with tapestries and triumphal arches. Wine flowed from public fountains. Nobles bowed. Foreign ambassadors observed with fascination and sometimes disgust. Anne, wearing cloth of gold and an ermine-trimmed mantle, was carried to Westminster Abbey. But while the official ceremonies were magnificent, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Many cheered politely, some shouted insults. Anne's enemies were everywhere: devoted supporters of Catherine, the Spanish faction, conservative clergy, nobles who resented the Boleyns, courtiers threatened by Anne's influence. Yet Anne moved forward, undeterred. She believed the future held security for her position, because she was carrying Henry's long-awaited son, or so they believed. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace. Henry was impatiently awaiting news of a prince. When the midwives presented the child, it was a girl, the future Queen Elizabeth III. Though disappointed, Henry insisted they could have sons later, but the birth shook Anne's position. Her enemies whispered that God did not favour her. Catherine's supporters saw Elizabeth's arrival as proof that Anne was not God's chosen queen. Anne's next pregnancies ended in miscarriages, likely 2, possibly 3, depending on sources. The most devastating miscarriage occurred in January 1536, a male fetus, around 15 weeks old. This loss shattered Henry. It also empowered his political rivals. At the same time, Henry began to grow close to a quiet, obedient lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. Anne sensed the danger. She argued with Henry more frequently. She lashed out at Jane. She threatened Cromwell's political ambitions. Anne's sharp tongue, once her greatest charm, became her greatest liability. Thomas Cromwell, once Anne's ally, had risen to enormous power through the dissolution of Catholic monasteries and the strengthening of royal authority. But Anne opposed some of his reforms and threatened his control over England's new church. Their conflict became personal and lethal. Cromwell realized that eliminating Anne would secure his influence and align him with conservative factions. He also knew that Henry, disillusioned and desperate for a son, might be willing to believe almost anything. Cromwell set a plan in motion, one of the most audacious political assassinations in English history. He would destroy the Queen, not just remove her, ruin her legacy, her family, her dignity, and he would do it through fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason. The turning point came on May 1st, 1536, during the annual May Day joust at Greenwich. Henry suddenly rose, left the event, and rode away with only a handful of men. Anne sensed something was horribly wrong. The next day she was summoned before the Privy Council and informed she was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. She protested fiercely, insisting on her innocence. It did not matter. Anne was arrested and taken by barge through Traitors' Gate into the Tower of London, the very place where she had once held celebration. As she entered, she fell to her knees and cried out, "I am innocent of all these charges." It was the beginning of the end. Anne's trial on May 15, 1536, is one of the most infamous judicial charades in history. The jury included men who owed their power to Cromwell, men who feared Anne, and men who despised her. The accusations were preposterous: adultery with 5 men, conspiracy to kill the king, incest with her brother, George Boleyn. The dates cited for the alleged affairs were impossible. Some occurred when Anne was pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Anne defended herself eloquently. Even her enemies admitted she carried herself with dignity and poise. But the verdict had been sealed before the trial began. Anne Boleyn was found guilty, sentenced to death. Her brother George was executed 2 days later. The other accused men were executed before him. Henry dismissed the queen he had once adored as though she were nothing. Anne waited in her cold chambers for the end. Anne prepared herself with astonishing composure. She prayed, she forgave, she comforted her ladies, she requested that the king treat her daughter, Elizabeth, kindly. Henry, perhaps wanting a clean conscience, ordered a swordsman from Calais, a more precise and humane execution method than the English axe. On May 19, 1536, Anne stepped out into the sunlight. She wore a grey gown with a crimson kirtle. Her face was pale but serene. Before she died, she spoke, "I pray God save the king. He has been a good, gentle, and sovereign lord to me. And if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best." Anne knelt. The executioner raised his sword, and with one swift stroke, England's most controversial queen was dead. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, no coffin, and buried in an unmarked grave at the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Anne Boleyn did not live to see her greatest legacy, but it came in the form of her daughter, Elizabeth. Elizabeth I would reign for 44 years, guiding England into a cultural and political golden age, an age of Shakespeare, naval triumphs and national identity. Anne's influence also shaped the English Reformation. She promoted scholars, funded translations of the Bible, and helped introduce new theological ideas to the king. Today, Anne is a feminist icon, a symbol of unjust persecution, a political revolutionary, a cultural phenomenon. Her story continues to inspire novels, films, scholarly debates, and fierce loyalty among her admirers. Anne Boleyn was more than a queen. She was a woman who transformed England and whose life, though cut short, changed the course of history. She gave birth to Elizabeth, future icon. Then came betrayal from former allies. A ruthless king moved to end her. 1536, downfall and execution, yet her life reshaped a nation and echoes through every Tudor tale. 5 centuries after her death, Anne Boleyn remains one of history's most compelling figures. A woman who rose farther than anyone believed possible and fell faster than anyone could imagine. She was ambitious, intelligent, flawed, brilliant, courageous, and unforgettable. And though Henry VIII took her life, he could never silence her legacy. Thank you for joining us for this in-depth exploration of Anne Boleyn. In our next episode, we will continue the story of the turbulent Tudor dynasty. Stay curious, stay questioning, and continue the journey with us. If you enjoy this story, subscribe for more videos. Like, comment, and share. Type Queen Anne in the comments.